Chapter 10. Off the Windy Stack. We'll set up a proper routine, Yank was saying, and we'll keep to the watches as they were fixed when we came aboard, except we'll make 4 watches of it for the night, in case we're out all night. We'll be 3 in each watch. I'll take one, Tiny another, Edwards the third, and Iceland here the other one. I'll have Taffy and Chum Jones in my watch. Is that okay, chaps? It's all right with us, said Taffy and the chum. Who'd you like with you, Tiny? I'll have Mike and Brum. What about you, Hans? Okay, said the Icelander, nodding towards little Nicky Sennison and Pete Cordoba. This left Curly Matheson and Don Wiggins for Titch Edwards' watch. All being well, they would not be called on, for the arrangement was that each watch would last 3 hours. One fellow in each watch looks after the mate, said Yank. That leaves 1 for lookout and 1 for the wheel. Change about every hour. Now, Taffy, you'd better have a look at Mr. Hughes. We've been a bit neglectful of him, and I'm sorry about it, but we've all been pretty fully occupied with the ship. Maybe if you speak Welsh to him nicely, he'll come around. And the chap looking after the mate makes some coffee too, or maybe tea, and toast, put in Tiny. Tea, glared the Icelander, horrified. He regarded tea as a most unmaritime beverage, but he was howled down. When nightfall came, the ketch was reaching towards the south stack, intending to round that obstruction with a good offing, in wild weather, but there was a hope of better conditions before too long. Now and again, a star peeped out in a passing clearing, and when it was well dark, they could make out the loom of some powerful lights. Very few of the boys had gone below. Those not actually on watch were huddled in their oilskins in the lee of the deck house, or in a corner of the counter abaft the wheel by a grating. It was driest there. It was pretty wet everywhere. Yank's watch was from 6 to 9 p.m., then Tiny until midnight, then Titch Edwards to 3 a.m., and Hans the Icelander from 3 to 6. At 9 o'clock, the ketch was still doing quite well, under the same short canvas she had been carrying most of the day, close-reefed main and mizzen, and a reefed fore-staysail. The sails loomed up black in the thick night, and the howling of the strong wind in the rigging was mournful and sad. But the BBC 9 o'clock news spoke of a possible moderation in the morning, though it was still full of gale warnings. Yank looked in at Mr. Hughes. He was still the same, chalked in his bunk in a deep sleep, or perhaps he was still unconscious. Taffy had made him as comfortable as possible, and the little cabin which the mate shared with the engineer was tolerably warm. Yank listened to the sea swishing by so close outside, just beyond the planks, Then he had a good look at the chart again. That place, Holyhead, looked good. It ought to be simple enough to sail in there. There was a book of sailing directions aboard for the whole of the United Kingdom coast. He looked up Holyhead. Those infernal sailing direction books always mentioned every possible danger and difficulty. They had to, of course, and the pages of this volume made Holyhead seem completely impossible, an unreachable haven hemmed in by a labyrinth of unsufferable dangers. "Ha!" Yank grunted and shut the book. Blast all sailing directions. The place was well enough lit. He'd cope with it when the time came. He'd a good picture of the entrance in his mind, and figured out what he would do. He was still turning over in his mind the best way to bring a big ketch under sail into the roads of Holyhead, as he stretched out on the deck-house settee, without taking off a stitch, not even his sou'wester, and prepared himself for an hour or two's rest. Good old Tiny had the deck now. If anything happened, Tiny would call him, and they would see what they could do. Let me see now, he thought. This place, Holyhead, he'd keep everything set until he was well inside. Must keep good way. There'd be a set across the entrance, between the breakwaters, and it would be folly to get the ship smashed up on a stone wall when she had been through so much. The wind's howl was slightly muffled, and there in the deck-house, with the doors closed. Now and again a cloud of heavy spray hit the weather side with a clump, and arms of water like little rivers ran down everywhere. Gosh, but he was tired. He couldn't remember ever having felt so tired in his life before, not even on the Bermuda race. It seemed about 5 minutes later, actually it was over 2 hours, when he was awakened by a wild thrashing of canvas, and thundering like heavy gunfire. Good Lord, what now? "Mainsail's gone," shouted Tiny, thrusting a wet head inside the deck-house for an instant. "I'm getting all hands up." Yank dashed over. Above his head the great gaff was flailing and banging, and enormous rays of blown-out canvas were twisting and thundering. The main deck was lit brilliantly every few seconds by the powerful beam of a revolting light, standing upon some rocks off the starboard bow. This was the South Stack, the way to Holyhead, but there could be no Holyhead now. The mainsail had to come down. The wind had eased somewhat, and thank heaven for that. But with only the mizzen and the staysail set, she couldn't fool around by night trying to run between the breakwaters at Holyhead, or at any other strange haven. First, that mainsail must come down. Yank shouted to the lad at the wheel. It was Mike, to keep well off the light. "Steer for Ireland, Mike," he yelled when he saw in the binnacle's light who it was. Although the sail had gone only a moment or so, Tiny already had things as well under control as they could be. The boom was hauled midships, and a group of boys was lowering away on the peak and throat halyards, while others were hauling down on the vang, the line which kept the gaff in order, or was supposed to do so. But no Vang could check the gaff when half the blown-out mainsail was clinging to it, and the whole peak of the sail was trying to twist the gaff from its jaws altogether. Quite out of control, the gaff would not come down. The Vang, unable to stand the strain, carried away. At that moment, the great light from the lighthouse showed a boy, 2 boys, struggling up the rigging to windward. The ship was rolling violently without the mainsail to steady her, though she was still going through the water quite well. Up the 2 figures climbed, now swung out above the sea, now rolled inboard above the decks. Their oilskins gleamed in the lighthouse beams as they fought their way up, step by step. Often they could only cling to the shrouds for their lives, while the sea boiled below them and the ship lurched as if she were intoxicated, or trying deliberately to shake them down. But slowly, steadily, they climbed. They were making for the jaws of the gaff, to ride the gaff down, hoping that their weight would turn the scales and force the gaff to descend. At the same time, they could work the halyards to help the stiff wire and sodden hemp through the blocks. Good idea. Now they were up. They'd reached the gaff. Yank saw one figure stand on the very jaws, the other climbing slowly past him, reached out, jumped for the gaff, and sat the gaff like a bronco buster on a wild mustang, riding it down by thunder. He'd need to ride well. Yank took a second to get a quick bearing on the light. She mustn't be set on that, and already she was almighty close. He jumped to the main saloon skylight, fisting the wet canvas with 6 lads, getting the canvas in, such as was left of it, helping to fight the gaff down from the jaws outwards. It was coming now, but coming with horrible slowness, but still descending. A great area of the sail blew out with a tremendous burst, and flung itself to leeward, flying off through the shrieking air as if its first stop would be the North Pole. Other cloths parted, and the air to leeward became a snarl of flying, twisting, wind-maddened canvas. Poor sail, but it came in the better now that there was so much the less of it. The gaff end was still flailing like a crane arm in an earthquake, but it was coming. The lads tried to lasso it from the deck. The figure astride the gaff was slowly working his way out. He caught the lasso, secured the end under control. The gaff came down quickly now, and the remains of the sail were roughly secured. The lads lashed the gaff to the boom in a fashion, not very seamanlike perhaps, but it would do. Neither gaff nor boom could cause any damage now. Yank saw it was Tiny who'd been riding the jaws of the gaff, and the Icelander who'd been further out. "Nice work, Tiny," he said, and grinned in the light beams at the Icelander. Hans was sniffing where the galley funnel had been, probably hoping for some sign of coffee. "Well, there goes our hopes of Holyhead," Tiny said. "It seems like the old ship wants to keep the sea and give us a good run for our money. How about Ireland, Yank? Isn't that place Kingstown or Dunlochare or whatever it is, more or less abeam of here? And Dublin, let's ask Mike. Mike, now do you know the way into Dublin, or Dunlochare? Asked Yank, taking a quick look across the compass at the South Stack light she was making on that anyway. Probably the tide must still be with her. I could take you all there in a bus, or on a train now, said Mike, who had a grip of the wheel as if it were the steering wheel of a recalcitrant steamroller. The boys laughed. Mike scratched his head. That isn't much use, snorted Tiny. This isn't a bus, you know, or a train. It's awful wild water off those parts, I know too, said Mike. There's banks and shoals all along the coast from Dublin Bay down. There's the Kish and the coddling light ships there. Now, to give warning, maybe we could get in. And maybe we could not, said Yank. Ah, well, we'll keep this easy canvas on her for the night now and see where we get in the morning. We'll get a good offing from this clump of bad-tempered rocks around here and run along northwards through the Irish Sea. Then when that nor'westerly comes, the broadcast spoke about, we can turn around and run back again. There's Liverpool, said Tiny, and there's the Isle of Man. We'll find somewhere it'll clear sooner or later. Why, it's clearing all the time right now, said Yank. You go below now, Tiny. It's well past midnight. We'll give Edwards his watch, and he can keep her running up in the middle of the Irish Sea. Nothing much can happen to her there. Titch Edwards took over the watch, going to the wheel. Curly Matheson went down to look after Mr. Hughes, and young Wiggins went to the lookout. At last, Bering showed Yank that the ship was perfectly all right. For the time being, she was not being set towards the land, and with the small canvas she was carrying, she could scarcely come to much harm. He went below to have a look at the chart, and read up on Liverpool and the Isle of Man, but the sailing directions were horribly pessimistic on both subjects. Liverpool, it seemed, lay on the banks of a dreadful river which had to be kept in check, with revetments on which sailing ships could come to fearful grief, and the surrounding dangers were infinite and varied. As for the Isle of Man, it seemed a good idea to give the whole place as wide a berth as possible. Oh, for the deep blue sea! The ship ran on quietly through the night. She had not so much speed now, and parts of the main deck were almost dry by the dawn. The dawn came cheerless enough, and gray, with a threat of fog. There was no land in sight, nothing but the gray cold sea, and the black ketch reeling on her way. They saw the lights of big ships, often enough in the night, once or twice indeed, too close for comfort, but daylight brought nothing. At 6, Hans the Icelander roused up all hands with a piping pot of coffee and a great jug of tea. It turned out that he had boiled the water and the tea leaves together throughout his watch, but the intention was good, and all who had leather stomachs gulped the stuff down. He'd found some mackerel lines in a deck locker too, and these trailed astern, with the lads of his watch taking turns to look after them. Every few moments a big mackerel struck at one or other of the lines and was promptly hauled in and put in a bucket. There must have been 20 or 30 already. The Icelander showed the boys how to split them easily and remove the bones. Then he spread the split fish on the top of the Carly float to dry. "Good for breakfast," he said. "Okay, okay," said Yank. "You fry 'em, Iceland." This the Icelander did by the simple means of rolling the fish in dry oatmeal and then putting the lot of them into a big, deep dish with a little fat, which he put into the oven. Meanwhile, the other lads, under Yank's and Tiny's direction, removed the skylight covers to let some air circulate down below, and tidied up generally. The mainsail was an awful mess, but the decks were all right, and there was nothing adrift aloft. The sail had gone when a cloth was chafed through, weakening the whole. Down below there was some sight pandemonium, where things had spilled out of the boys' gear, and so on. But she was not too bad. It was not the first time the ketch had been in a blow, and things down below had been well secured. A grand meal of fried mackerel and bread, with more of what the Icelander called tea, gave the day a bully start. Now there was a touch of pale sun, though the visibility was still very poor. "What d'ye say we shift the mainsail and bend the mizzen there?" said Yank. "I've looked all through the ship, and there certainly isn't a spare main aboard. I've tried the mate, too, but he's still out. I guess there isn't room to carry a spare big sail like that, and fit a dozen boys in too." "Her other mainsails are in the locker on the wharf at Aberdovey," said Tiny. "Yes, good idea, Yank. We'll get on with it right away. She can wander along under the staysail, with the reef shaken out meantime. She won't come to any harm." The lads got to work at once, leaving one at the wheel, and one standing by down below in case Mr. Hughes revived. Once or twice the mate had stirred uneasily, but as yet he showed no signs of returning to consciousness. Shifting the blown-out sail was not much of a job, and the lads bundled it down below without ceremony. It could wait until the ship was back at Aberdovey. Getting the mizzen changed was a bit more work, but it progressed steadily. The BBC weather forecast still spoke of gale warnings, and gales and more vile weather, though the Irish Sea was not being specifically singled out for further horrors at the moment. Before the weather forecast, there are warnings of gales in sea areas, and so forth and so on every time. As soon as that guy says before, I fear the worst, said Yank. Taffy and his cruising round. Taffy looked hurt. Where are we off to now, Yank? Asked Mike. How about Dublin Bay? It's me for the open water, while the visibility's as bad as this. We're past Dublin already, Yank replied. Say, Do any of you guys know any place on the Isle of Men?" "Isle of Man, you mean," said Tiny. "I've never been there. Have you, Edwards?" "No, Tiny." A chorus of no's from the others clinched that. Nobody knew the way into Douglas or anywhere else on the Isle of Man. "All we've got to do is thread a way past. Let's go the Irish side," Yank concluded. "If so, be it does clear up, maybe we can have a crack at getting in some place. And what about that nor'west wind the broadcasters promised us? It looks mighty like southwest to me." Indeed, the wind was sticking at southwest, though each forecast in turn throughout the day spoke of coming northwest winds in the Irish Sea. Nor did the visibility improve. While the ship was wandering slowly along under her staysail only, a whole line of little ships meandered across her bow, all bound directly westwards. "Tide time in the Mersey," said Tiny. "That's the coasters going to Ireland." There were small steamers with enormous green funnels, curious old-timers with their engines aft and thin high smokestacks, looking like up-ended cigarettes, and as far as anyone could see, not a soul on deck. Little steamer after little steamer seemed to be wandering along on her own, finding her way to Ireland without the aid of any human beings. There was no one in sight to hail. "Well, they've given us a check on where we are, anyway," Yank remarked appreciatively. "Let's follow 'em now," said Mike, with brilliant inspiration. At this speed, Mike lad, how the dickens can we? Look, boy, the half of 'em are lost in the mist again, already. If we'd the gale now, we could do it all right and sail around 'em." There was obviously nothing to do but wander on. They set the mizzen as a mainsail, and the ketch sailed northwards very pleasantly. At any rate, for the time being, she was coming to no harm. The day passed with no change. Still Mr. Hughes lay in his bunk below, dead to the world. Chapter 11. The North Atlantic. "I guess we might as well have a crack at sailing right around Ireland," said Yank gloomily, as the boys listened to the early morning weather forecast down in the saloon. It spoke of fresh to strong southerly in the Irish Sea, increasing later to gale force, severe at times, and veering to southwest. What happened to that nor'wester they promised us? "Guess it petered out," said Tiny. "They often do, you know. But I like that idea of yours, Yank. Let's have a go. Right around Ireland. I've always wanted to do that." "Well, it looks like we'll get back to Aberdovey as quick that way as any other. How far is it now?" The charts were open on the table, and the lads pored over them with dividers and parallel rules. Tiny measured off the approximate distance. "I make it to be about 700 sailing miles from about where we are now in the North Channel, right around and back to Aberdovey. That's allowing for giving the land a good offing the whole way. It might take us a week or more, or a fortnight. Well, we haven't much choice now than to continue to run before the wind and thread the ship up here through this place, the North Channel. Yank studied the chart. Let's see now, that's Scotland. Darn it, I wanted to see that place too. This side's Ireland. We've got to run through and out here south of this place Islay. Then we're in the North Atlantic. We give Ireland a berth. Bowl on down the west side. Whiz around the corner by Fastnet here. And then wham-ho for Aberdovey. Why do you think we can bowl along southwards west of Ireland when we can only scud to the northward here, Yank? It was Taffy who asked the question. It's a hope, Taff, but look, this is the way I figure it. At any rate, we've got the BBC weather forecast to give us the weather outlook. Seems to me like the wind almost always starts in the south and southwest around these parts, and then maybe or not it blows like the devil. Then it hauls west and around to northwest and blows itself out from there. The way I figure it, we've had a bellyful of south and southwest now, and we must be due for northwest some time. I'll gamble on running her every mile we can get out of this southerly, and then about the time we're making west of Ireland, it'll be northwest, and we'll scud before that. What? Sail all around, all Ireland, without ever once going in, past all that lovely island? This was from Mike, of course. "'Fraid so, Mike, but we might have to go in somewhere, of course. There's another thing, chaps. Mr. Hughes will be better one of these days. There's color back in his face now, and he's breathing better. He'll help us, I'll say. It'll be a mighty astonished Mr. Hughes that finds himself to the westward of Ireland, I'll bet. Then we'll be about due for a sou'westerly blow again, about the time we get off the fast net." Yank mused on, as much to himself as to the others. "Then, too, we'd have Queenstown to run for, and Waterford, and just around the corner into Rosaire, and all those places. We'd have sea-room, too. Danged if I want to go sailing a ship any more around these crowded, bad-tempered waters here. Did you see that big tanker brush past us around midnight? Fairly gave me a shave, he did. He whizzed within 3 inches of the old ship's side, and he wasn't the only one," said Tiny. "In my watch I got mixed up with a bunch of trawlers out of Fleetwood or somewhere. The whole place was buzzing with sirens and rushing ships, and some fast railway ferry had us rolling in her bow wave and her wake. I reckon we must have crossed the tracks of all the shipping bound for Belfast and up channel for the Clyde. All the blooming night. It was a game." "Oh, said the Icelander with a grin. "Plenty ships, plenty hurry, no good." "Well, it might be a game," Yank concluded, "but it's a game I reckon I've had enough of. Okay, now we've got to dodge this Mull of Kintyre, and this Rathlin Island, and we still can't see a thing. Once I get out of all that Irish Sea, I'm not going back in there again. Not ever. You know, said Chum Jones, I suppose we could go into some place in Scotland when it clears, and then the captain would come back and take her over. When it clears, did you say? That's the catch, Chum. When will it clear? Meantime, we'd be past all Scotland and next stop Iceland. There's a lot of mouldy islands to pile up on around that Scots coast too. Besides, here we are with a ship. It's a situation we aren't likely to find ourselves in again, or any other bunch of boys either. We won't give up that easy. It wasn't giving up, said Chum Jones. It was the navigation I was thinking of. Who can navigate? We won't have to. We'll see something when it's clear. There's a sextant aboard and a nautical almanac. I can get a noon sight. Come to that, and fix the latitude. That and the log'll do us. You chaps are good at chart work. Good enough anyway. Come on now, around old Ireland. The project fired the boys' imaginations. A quick look in the coal bunker showed plenty of anthracite to keep the patent stove going for a fortnight, and a sounding in the freshwater tanks showed water enough. As for food, the mackerel were leaping for the hooks, and there were still all the supplies they had flung aboard off the bar, and the ship's reserves as well. This consisted mainly of bully beef and biscuits, plenty of marmalade, and the makings of soup. Curly Matheson was appointed permanent cook and steward to conserve supplies and dish out the food, and he said there should be little difficulty. There was even plenty of condensed milk for the coffee and tea, though some of the boys voted for eating up all the condensed milk at once, in case they got seasick again if the weather worsened. This idea had something to commend it, but it was howled down. On deck, all was going well. True, the mizzen looked a trifle odd and very small on the big main mast, and there was nothing set at all on the mizzen mast. The staysail and the big jib were set to help, and the patent log showed the ship to be doing at least 5 knots. It was still thick, and the fog horn was going up in the bows. 2 lads were on lookout there, and the watch system was carried on through the day. The wind was slowly freshening again, but the ship was under the lee of the land, and there was no excessive motion. If only it would clear, the conditions would be quite enjoyable. Down below, Mr. Hughes appeared to be sleeping a little more comfortably. Both sides of his skylight were open to bring in good fresh air. Taffy and Chum Jones had bathed the old mate's head again. They pronounced it much better. Mr. Hughes stirred once or twice while they tended him. He won't be long now, said Taffy. And a good job too, Chum Jones was worried. I'm not over-trusting of these Yankee navigators and Conway chart work. Well, you can check it yourself, can't you now? Chum Jones piped down. They heard the sirens of big ships more frequently than they wanted to, and once the great white bow wave of some liner slowed down to 20 knots, came frightfully close. "Thank the Lord for radar," Yank confided to Tiny. "I suppose most of these big ships do have radar these days." "Aye, most of them. All liners have, at any rate, so they ought not to run into us. Pity we can't speak to one and send a message back to the school. They might be worried about us." "Might, do you say? It's a strong might, Yank. Our people will be worried too. There's been no possible report of the ship since we showed her off the Dovey Bar." "Well, we'll drive her along. We ought to see some fishermen off Ireland anyway when it clears. They've got two-way radio telephones these days, and they can send in a report." "We won't say anything about Mr. Hughes," Yank continued, "or they would be worried." "We'd better listen to the BBC News to see if there's anything about the ship," said Tiny. "So far, we've only been listening to the weather." Sure enough, the news at 1 o'clock mentioned the ship. "No news has been received from the training ketch, Warspite, believed to be somewhere in the Irish Sea, since the vessel was blown away from Cardigan Bay several days ago," the announcer said. "The vessel is carrying 12 boys from the Outward-Bound Sea School. No anxiety is felt as the chief officer, a man of considerable experience in sailing ships, is aboard, but all shipping is requested to keep a lookout for the ketch." "He'd be a bit more anxious if he could see his chief officer now," said young Edwards. "Chief officer? I like that. It does sound a phony name for a good old mate aboard here. But they mean well, and it's a danged good thing they don't know what's happened to Mr. Hughes too," said Yank. "There was nothing the boys could do to make the whereabouts of the ship known, except do their best to sail her back again. All right, around Ireland. It might be a business." Still, as Yank and Tiny and the older lads agreed, there was nothing like being bold. So the ketch sailed merrily on, gradually increasing speed, and Mr. Hughes was slowly mending, and the routine of the sea life settled over them all surprisingly well. Yank conducted the ship in style, with the proper bells and reports from helmsman and lookout and all that, as in a big sailing ship, and he and Tiny and Tich Edwards and Hans walked the weather side of the little poop in turn. He was keeping as good a plot on the chart as he could, and the log readings were faithfully recorded in the rough deck book every hour. The boy at the wheel always smartly repeated the course, and the lad, relieved, repeated the course too, as he went forward. The lookout came aft to report his relief. The decks were kept clear. The gear was seen to the galley was spotless. The smell of damp was driven out of the quarters, except where the big, wet heap of the blown-out mainsail lay, and Mr. Hughes could not have been better cared for if he'd had half a dozen state-registered nurses looking after him. "I dunno," Yank mused. "Danged if I wouldn't like to be making for St. John's. A feller could easily take to this life, Tiny." "Newfoundland or New Brunswick?" asked Tiny with a grin. "Oh, you mean which St. John's? Newfoundland, Tiny. T'other is plain St. John. Besides, Newfoundland's nearer. I feel like that guy Cabot, or Cabati, or whatever his name was. You know, the Italian guy who sailed across to Newfoundland from the west of England, when he heard about the Portuguese fishing there. I'd sooner be Captain Cook, said Tiny. Well, he spent plenty of time in Newfoundland, too, and I guess he passed this way more than once. He had a humdinging little schooner in the Newfoundland Survey for years. Why, Yank, you know more about him than I do. I always thought he just discovered Australia and was murdered by the savages in Hawaii. Old Cook's always been one of my heroes. I've always studied those great sailors, said Yank, staring over the sea and striking a pose unconsciously, rather like Christopher Columbus himself. You know, I get bothered that there isn't any more discovering to do. Just imagine it now. You can feel a bit like Cook here. Imagine there wasn't any Australia on the maps yet, or New Zealand, or Hawaii, or New Caledonia, or the dozen other places he found. We'd have somewhere to go then, all right. We wouldn't have any BBC telling us the weather, though, or liners keeping out of our way, because they'd picked us up on their radar screens. We're lucky to be able to sail round Ireland without half the destroyers in the fleet looking for us and a couple of salvage tugs racing out of Londonderry. Good job they don't know about Mr. Hughes. Yeah, I guess. We're lucky at that. Come along, good breeze, bowl us along, and turn nicely to northwest, or north, some place by the corner, please. We'll be blessed lucky if it does that, you know. I believe it is clearing a bit, though. Indeed it was. The bad visibility was rolling back off the sea, like a cloud slipping from a mountain top, and the sunlight was streaming down as if anxious to make amends for its consistent absence earlier. It groped its way towards the ketch, and suddenly found her flooding the wet teak decks with glorious warmth, and touching the sails to a spotless white. The boy on the lookout looked back and grinned, and the lad at the wheel grinned at him. The boys below came tumbling up the companion forward to bask in the sun. This was the life, but the improved visibility disclosed the vessel sailing across a blue and empty sea. There was no sign of Ireland or Scotland, and there were no ships or trawlers or anything whatever to be seen. Steer west-southwest, Yank called to the helmsman. We'll pick up Innistrahole or Mullen Head. Anyway, we must be out of the North Channel and clear of Scotland. Let her go. Chapter 12. The Weather Makes Amends. We're darn lucky, that's what I say. Here's the very wind we ordered, right where we wanted it. If you fellows think that sort of thing happens often in the North Atlantic, you've got another think coming. That's all that I can say. The speaker was Chum Jones. My father's been sailing the Western Ocean all his life, and he hasn't a good word to say for it, put in Titch Edwards. Maybe the sea gods think we had enough bad weather on the other side of Ireland. Whoever we've got to thank for it, I must say I'm mighty grateful for one, chipped young Don Wiggins. I'll have something to tell 'em when I get back to Leafield. Now, I feel like Christopher Columbus. Senor Columbus was not sick like you, Donald, said Pete. I'm better now, Pete. I've been all right these last couple of days. The ketch was slipping along before a lovely breeze, out of the northwest, absolutely made to order. Away on her port beam the boys could see the blue haze of Ireland, somewhere about the bloody foreland. At least, Yank said it was probably some place in that area. He'd had a few shots at working up a position line by some patent method he said he had learned on the Bermuda race. But though the two Conways and Chum Jones helped him the whole morning, and they took no end of observations, somehow that position line would persist in passing through either Cape Farewell or the Chicago stockyards, considering they were using an old alarm clock for a chronometer, and none of them had much experience with the sextant. Perhaps the line off Cape Farewell was not so bad. Yank did get a good noon sight. Working that out was easy enough. He explained that all he had to do was to measure the altitude of the sun right at noon, and you could watch it climb in the sextant, and note when its climbing ceased, and that was obviously noon, and then the nautical almanac told him the latitude where the sun was overhead. So the sun's altitude at the ship could be converted by a simple calculation into an accurate indication of how far she was from the place where the sun was overhead. Hence the latitude was a simple matter of subtraction. Easy, said Yank. I don't get it, said Mike, and 6 or 8 other boys echoed the sentiment. Anyway, the latitude's about 55 degrees north, Yank announced, though with no air of finality. We've got to keep her well off the coast a while. It sticks out to the westward plenty, just south of here. All County, Mayo, and Comoras there, said Mike. You're surely not going by all those lovely places now, Yank. I'd give my eye teeth to be going in there, any place there. 'Fraid it's all a bunch of rocks to us now, Mike. We've got to hurry past. If the wind came from the west now, we'd be in a fix. We're gambling, you know. The ship hasn't got large-scale charts for these little ports either. She doesn't ordinarily come around here. There's big ports too, Yank, my boy. There's Galway on a bit, and there's Limerick south of that. Fine big cities, they are both. Mike looked aggrieved. Sorry, Mike, but we really daren't even go in close for a look until we can see the fast net or Cape Clear. I promise you, though, we'll do some coasting there if the weather's clear. We'll go in so's we can hear the dogs barking on the farms. Not that we've got anyone who can recognize 'em like Taffy can around Port Dinellan and Nevin. Indeed I can that, said Taffy, delighted to think of sundry hounds and other beasts he knew quite well by sight and sound, by Morphinevin, and Mr. Hughes knows 'em all from Hell's Mouth, right around to Barmouth. Ah, Mr. Hughes, now, it's time he came to. I'll run down again and take a look. Taffy was back in a few moments, with the report that Mr. Hughes looked much better than he had even an hour earlier. His eyes had opened, he said, when he went into the cabin, but he hadn't said anything. Maybe it's concussion he's got, as well as the nasty cut on the head, said Taffy. Maybe we ought to keep quiet and not disturb him. Old sailors don't get concussion, put in Chum Jones. He must have something pretty bad to be out so long, Taffy agreed. Anyway, I've been treating him for concussion, like it says in the shipmaster's medical guide. That's in the medicine chest. If he survived that crack on the skull, he'll survive the treatment too. Boy, that man's skull must be iron, said Chum Jones, with some envy. You're not very kind now to my treatment, said Taffy. If you could speak the Welsh now, I'd be telling you something. Peace, lads, peace. Is this what a spell of decent weather does to you? And didn't I hear somebody say something intelligent about keeping quiet a while? We'll start the holy stoning up in the eyes of her if this is to be the racket. Come to think of it, that brass could do with a bit of wipe. Who's watch on deck? The lads melted away rapidly. They had been grouped round the deck house on the sunny side. All was quiet for a while when they had dispersed. The ship creaked gently along, her motion easy and her stride graceful, with perfect rhythm. Out here in the open North Atlantic, the sea ran long and true, and there were no ugly holes in it, as there were in Cardigan Bay and the Irish Sea. There was just life enough in the good wind to fleck the water here and there with a little white to bring it to life. The ship was running a good 7 knots, even with her reduced canvas, and she was steering like a witch. Her bows slipped easily through the long blue seas, and her wake astern was clean and straight. So the day passed, the 4th, since she had been blown out of Abersoch. Only 4 days. It seemed an age. All the lads now felt like resurrected shades of Columbus or Cabot or Cartier, or some one of the illustrious pioneers of the great sailing past. The tones of the BBC announcer giving out what passed for news seemed to come from another world. Each bulletin now had some mention of the ship. The 6 o'clock evening announcer spoke lugubriously of some wreckage that had been found on the coast of Nevin, and of an aerial search that was planned in the Irish Sea. The wreckage was an old hatch encrusted with barnacles. How that could possibly have any connection with the ketch, which had neither hatches nor barnacles, the news bulletin didn't say. Goats, said Taffy scornfully. Why don't they ever get a single thing right about ships? Hatches come off cargo ships. Barnacles take months to grow. As soon as any ship is alleged to be missing, some stupid ass is finding wreckage from her. I bet that hatch was on the beach by Nevin when I was a boy. What are you now, Taffy? Asked Yank. Taffy grinned. I'm hoping no poor airman will lose his life looking for us where we aren't to be found, said Tiny quietly. That happens far too often, and still not a sign of a trawler to pass the report. It must be very poor fishing around these parts, is it, Mike? The best fishing in all the world. Where's the trawlers then? Inshore, my boy, there's no need for 'em to come out this far nowadays. Why, half the crabbers out of the Bay o' Biscay come up here too, and the little purse seiners from Spain, taking fish by the ton. It's the best fishing in all the world. Shh! You'll be waking the dead. I'm worried about that BBC report, though. Our people be sure getting bothered now. Keep a good lookout for fishing lights tonight, boys, and call me if you see any of you. We'll get a signal to them somehow. The idea of unnecessary alarm was disconcerting, but what could be done? As Yank had said, they ought not to go much further without being reported by some kind of vessel. But the ketch continued to run, and there were no cargo vessels in sight, making for Galway or Limerick. Nor did they see a trawler. Big ships crossing the Atlantic made either for Malin or for Fastnet. The night brought no lights, but the loom of some great lighthouses ashore, one after the other all night long, some nearer, some further, sometimes only the loom of the light below the horizon, at other times the light itself. Tiny timed the flashes and gauged the characteristics to identify the bigger lights in the ship's light list. She was heading due south after midnight, more or less in line with the coast. As the hours passed without any sign of change of wind, and the BBC bulletins promised good weather, Yank allowed the ship to creep in nearer to the coast, intending to make the land boldly off the Blasket Islands or Valentia in the morning. Sure enough, the morning brought a blue haze of lovely land on the port bow. This was grand progress. Hans, whose watch it was, had the wheel a little after dawn, with one of his watchmates aloft to see what he could make out of the land, and the other in the galley brewing some brown, wet stuff he called tea. The ketch was sailing beautifully, and the morning gave promise of another good day. Slowly Hans became aware that someone else was on deck. Someone else had come up the companion from the little alleyway below. "Where's Mulfer now, boy?" a well-known voice roared from just forward of the mizzen. Its roar was weak, but it was still roar. "Where's Mulfer?" "Is gone, sir," said Hans. Gone. Mr. Hughes, reeling a little in the fresh morning air, looked absolutely bewildered. "Mulfer gone? What's happened then in Wales?" "Ireland," said Hans, with an expressive wave of his hand towards the maze of the land. Mr. Hughes gulped, staggered to the grating, sat down, and stared about him like a man slowly recovering from a bad dream. He put up his hand to scratch his head, and found the bandages there, and looked even more bewildered. He stared to windward, and then to leeward, and stared at the deep blue sea, and he looked everywhere for the green-gray turbulence of Cardigan Bay. Mulfer gone, and Snowdon, Cadaradris, Mulhabog, Bird Rock, all gone. Ireland, on that side of us. He gasped. "Where is the ship?" "Ireland," said Hans. "We go round." "We go round? My head's going round," said Mr. Hughes. "What happened?" "Storm," said Hans. "Gaff come down, wham, hit you. We crossed the causeway. You help. Crossed the causeway? Mr. Hughes looked like a man realizing that what he'd thought was a bad dream had been no dream at all. Hans made his remarks brief as they were, immensely more impressive by gesticulations and sundry sounds meant to represent storms, a flailing gaff, seas breaking on the causeway, and maritime vicissitudes in general. Mr. Hughes looked at him, astonished. He kept peering in the compass bowl at the land, aloft at the mizzen bent in place of the main, and out over the North Atlantic, in turn as if he never would be able to make out what had happened. The arrival of the lad from the galley with a dish of powerful tea did something to revive him. The tea shocked him more fully back into consciousness. "Tea, Mr. Hughes. It's grand to see you again on deck. Sir, are you all right now?" Mr. Hughes took the proffered mug. "Tea, you call it? You don't need a mug for this stuff, son. It'd stand up by itself." "Ugh!" But the old mate tossed it down with a grimace. "It'd start the engine. How long have I been down below, lad?" The boy reckoned up. "Maybe a week, I think, sir. But I've lost a bit count of the days. Like since we started this voyage. I'll go call the Yank." The boy disappeared, and Yank was back with him like a flash, smiling to see Mr. Hughes on deck once more. It took a long time to explain to the injured mate just what had happened. When he understood at last, and this was not before the 8 o'clock BBC News threw further enlightenment on the situation by more references to the Nevin wreckage and the air search that was to take place that day, he thoroughly approved all that had been done. "You've done well, lads," he said. "Mr. Holt will be pleased. This is just the kind of voyage he'd like all the boys to get a chance at, but I can't believe it. You mean to tell me you have brought the ship right out of the Irish Sea and round most of Ireland, and that's County Kerry I'm looking at over yonder now, at the sou'west of Ireland. Well, sir, it's where County Kerry ought to be. I'm not saying any more than that, but here's the plot on the chart here. I was going to haul up a bit and get closer to the land for identification, but I didn't want to take any chances on these rocks here, this Skellig and these Bull Rocks, pointing to them on the chart. We've been lucky with the weather once we decided to go round Ireland and not to fight the wind, but we can still get a dirty kick onto those rocks, I reckon. You're right, lad. Never trust the North Atlantic." Mr. Hughes gave a close look at the chart and carefully noted the way the ship had come. He sent for the deck book and compared the patent log readings with the distances measured off, and checked the compass course. Now and again he grimaced a little, as if his head hurt him, but he found nothing to cause him any pain in the record of that extraordinary run, and myself lying down below all the time, he kept saying to himself, as if he was trying to force himself to believe it, and gales and fog and lee shores and a stream of ships and everything else. And now there are airplanes out looking for the ship, you say. Yes, sir, that's what the radio tells us. We can't have that. We'll clap every stitch to her we can, and chase her along. Now you get some lads to break out everything that's in the sail locker aft there. We'll find something to bend on the mizzen there, and maybe a rag of old staysail that'll make a gaff topsail to help that little sail upon the main, or something we can contrive for a spinnaker. The spinnaker itself is in the shed at Aberdovey. It isn't spinnaker time in Cardigan Bay, as you well know. A gang of lads brought up everything that was in the sail locker, which was reached through a small hatch abaft the wheel. There were 2 spare jibs, an old staysail, and a summer topsail. Just as I thought, said Mr. Hughes. We'll make do fine with this lot. Now we'll bend this staysail for a leg o' mutton on the mizzen mast. That'll balance her. We'll get the gaff topsail set somehow, and we'll use yon other staysail for a spinnaker while she can run. Mr. Hughes was unable to get about. He sat on the grating aft in the sun with his back against the Carley float. Under his skillful and experienced old eyes, the work of setting every possible stitch went on splendidly. He looked approvingly at the group of boys who were the crew. It was understandable that those with previous sea training would fit in and pick up the work quickly, like the 2 Conway boys, the Pangbourne lad, and Taffy from Nevin. He'd been born in a boat, so had the Icelander, like as not, and the Yankee lad had previous experience of ocean yacht racing. But the others, why, they were working like veterans too. Dark Pete from South America, the lad who was an apprentice cook with the London caterers, the boy from Birmingham, and the little chap from somewhere in the Cotswolds, and the young chap from Manchester who'd looked so pale and pasty-faced when he came marching down to see the warspite alongside at Aberdovey those few swift weeks ago. Now the whole lot of them acted and worked and looked like a real bunch of sailors, sailing ship sailors. If he'd not seen something of the kind happen often before, Mr. Hughes never would have believed it. But the boys were all right. All boys were all right, given a chance, he mused. The miracle of the catches happened every month at Aberdovey, though never before quite like this. Soon every possible stitch was set and drawing, and the ship bounded along. The wind freshened with the morning, and she had all that she could stand. She was running a nice 9 or 10 knots, and the coast of Ireland came up almost hand over hand. The wind hauled out to the westward as the ship approached the corner. Ballast Head, Dursey, Sheep's Head, Mizzen Head raced by. The Fastnet came in clear view. "I know that corner," said Yank excitedly. "I know the way now." "So does the ship, too, by the feel of her," said Tiny. "She's going like a scalded cat." Round the Fastnet she raced, close to and with every stitch of canvas drawing handsomely, sheets taut, and the spinnaker trying to lift her right out of the water. The big ketch romped along the coast of southern Ireland, with a great bone in her mouth, like a St. Bernard with a shank of ham racing for its kennel. "Go on, good ship," said Mr. Hughes delightedly. "Fix me a bunk in the deck house, Yank," he added. "I'll spend the night in there. I've been time enough down below." He looked at Yank a moment or two. "It's a fine thing you did, you know," he said at last. "And you'd grand lads to help you. I'm all for a bit of sea room. This bit of deep water sailing's doing my old bones good. Split head and all." Chapter 13. The Rescue. The good conditions continued through the night, for the wind seemed to swing round Ireland with the ship. For once the forecasts were tolerably correct. The BBC spoke of fresh to strong southerlies still blowing up St. George's Channel and in the Irish Sea, and promised at least another day of westerlies or west-southwest winds off South Ireland. The little ship ran on past Cape Clear and Galley Head, and the old head of Kinsale, and the first light of day found her racing past the entrance to the Cove of Cork. Mr. Hughes was out at the crack of dawn to see how she was faring and how the gear stood. He paused by the rail a moment, looking into the lovely Cork harbour. "Ah, sir, couldn't we go in there now?" from Mike. "It's the loveliest bay in all Ireland. It's a shame to be rushing past like a bunch of Yankee tourists." Poor Mike was almost in tears. "I wish we could, son," said the mate, "but we have to use the wind while we can. It's fair wanting us to hurry back to Aberdovey. Now, will you bend the flags I hand out to you, and we'll make our number and pass close by every lighthouse and lightship we see, so's we can be reported, and relieve the minds of them that's waiting ashore." Mr. Hughes handed out 4 large square flags from the locker, and Mike secured them to the halyards on the main truck, and hoisted the flags aloft. They were colored flags of the international code, used by all ships, and the 4 together made the distinguishing signal of the training ship or spite, MBVC, they said, which to any seaman or coast guard with the appropriate book meant at once, "I am the Warspite of London." "Somebody'll be sure to see that before long, and pass in a report of us," said Mr. Hughes, looking aloft, where the 4 flags were straining at the halyards and blowing out bravely in the fresh morning wind. "Aye, and the sooner the better. Let's have some of that Iceland coffee now." At the word coffee, Hans the Icelander came along the deck at the double, with a great grin. "Mornin', Mr. Hugh," he said. "No mofer, by and by." "Yes, by and by we'll be seeing Molfer all right, if we go on like this," rejoined Mr. Hughes. I fetched the coffee, and down dived Hans through the companion without touching the teak steps, for already there was a grand aroma coming from the galley. Curly Matheson was at work in there. The patent stove in the training ship was the type which never goes out, if it is looked after at all, and keeps itself going with a minimum of fuel. It had 2 ovens and 2 large hot plates, so there was plenty of room to prepare a huge pot of coffee, and all the breakfast the boys could eat, and bake a cake as well if you wanted to. There was plenty of hot water for washing up. A little port gave light but no air, for the sea was frequently right over it. The galley deck was just big enough to provide working room for 1 and to allow another to squeeze in if necessary, and the whole galley was designed to be worked easily and efficiently. Here Curly Matheson was undisputed captain, and he knew what to do. He'd opened 6 large cans of Canadian sausages, a can of bacon to add flavor, and 12 cans of beans, in rich tomato sauce, and had the whole lot in an enormous deep dish with a little fat which would soon convert the mess into a wonderful seafaring breakfast. There was no bread left, for the boys had been hard on that, and it wouldn't keep forever, but there was plenty of biscuits, and margarine, and marmalade, and jam, and there was still 1 can of condensed milk. This ship's motion was not bad enough to upset the cooking, or the preparations for breakfast generally. Perhaps the boys were all thoroughly accustomed to it by that time. There were high raised edges erected round both the narrow tables to keep the dishes in place, and each boy's place had its own special fence rigged across the table to make sure his plate of food did not slosh about. It could jump off the board, of course, if he let it, but this he never did. The food disappeared into his throat much too fast. Except for the 3 on deck, all the boys had breakfast together. It was a happy meal. It's only 150 miles to go from off Cork to Aberdovey. Bar as I make it on the chart, said Yank, eating his 7th sausage. That's about it, said Tiny. She was logging 8 in my watch, so if she keeps that up, we oughtn't to be more than about 20 hours. Say 24, allowing for a drop in the wind at night, put in Chum Jones. You'd better say thank the Lord if the conditions do keep up, said Mr. Hughes. Let's hear what the BBC has to say on the subject. It's just 5 minutes to 8. This is the BBC Home Service, the announcer began, right on the dot. Before, the boys let out a unanimous groan. The weather forecast. There are gale warnings. Another loud groan. In sea areas, Iceland, Forties, Hebrides, and many more areas, but not, thank heavens, the Irish Sea, nor anywhere near the south of Ireland. There the forecast was for southwest winds. It's always a gale off Iceland, said Tiny, but where's this place Forties? It's some miserable corner of the North Sea, where the temperature never gets above 40, said Chum Jones. You mean Cardigan Bay, then? That isn't the North Sea. It's nothing to do with the temperature, chaps, said Titch Edwards, with a great air of knowledge. It's something to do with the latitude. Says who? No latitude 40 goes any place near the North Sea. It goes through the blooming Mediterranean. My guess is it takes 40 poor guys to guess the weather there, was Yank's opinion, so it can't be near the Irish Sea. It takes only 1 guy to guess the weather in that place, from what I've seen of it. It's really a fishing area, I think, said Mr. Hughes, when he could get a word in. It's a 40-fathom bank in the North Sea. The news had nothing further to say about the missing warspite for the moment. Mr. Hughes hoped the Irish Coast Guards would have had an opportunity to make out the flags, or the lighthouse man on Ballycotton, for they went in close enough for him to read the ship's name with a decent telescope. They had to keep further off Knockcadoon and Helwick for the course from off Cobb to Aberdovey was directly to the Tusker Light and on in a more or less straight line. They were disappointed when the 1 o'clock news declared that they were still missing, though it did speak of a small sailing vessel with indistinguishable signals, which had been sighted off the south of Ireland. Experts, the announcer continued, were of the opinion that this was not the missing training ship, which they said could not be in these waters, and the description of the vessel does not agree with certain features of the well-known training ship. Experts my eye, I can just see those blooming experts, sitting in some comfortable swing chair ashore, said Tiny. When I graduate, said Yank, I'm going to be an expert. On anything. You don't have to know a thing, so long as the other guys think you do, preferably the guys who give you the job. Now don't go blaming the radio lads, said Mr. Hughes. The announcer's doing his best. It's the news he's supplied with he's reading. He doesn't make it, and he isn't an expert. And as for the other guys thinking you know your stuff, Yank, you'll find the world isn't fooled that easy. By the time the 6 o'clock news came around, when the ketch was racing on past Carnsore Point, with the Tusker in sight, still going wonderfully after a glorious day, the radio had decided that the strange ketch with indistinguishable signals was probably a French fisherman, though by that time they had passed and spoken 17 trawlers from Milford Haven, 23 fishermen out of Waterford, 9 large oil tankers, some inward and some outward bound, 2 Harrison cargo liners, a Clan liner, the Ellerman City of Birmingham, which they had gone near enough to see, a couple of small elephants peering over the side, and to wave to the crew, Alfred Holtz, Helenus, which had clearly recognized them, the U.S. Line's American scientist, the Hollander Ringendam, and the Queen Elizabeth in the distance, to say nothing of another score or so big vessels, more or less hull down on the horizon, and 5 large 4-engined aircraft coming and going to Shannon Airport. Well, blow me down, said Mr. Hughes. I don't know what we could do to advertise the Warspite better than we've done, unless we could sail her into Portland Place, there in London. I was hoping our folks would have their minds relieved this night. I was indeed. The Warrior'll be spoiling the course up at the school. Mr. Hughes obviously put the course and the school even ahead of his own immediate relatives, if he had any. He looked forward greatly to a continuance of the good wind through the night, and to reaching Aberdovey in the morning. It's rum we don't see any of those airplanes that's supposed to be looking for us, Yank, said Chum Jones, as the boys were seated along the skylight in the early evening. The gulls were shouting and soaring astern, now dipping down to pick up some morsel which Curly had flung overboard from the slop bucket, now giving a wonderful exhibition of perfect gliding, squawking the whole time. "What's that?" suddenly shouted Tiny. "That's no seagull." He leapt to his feet, pointing into the sky. The boys followed his startled shout. "There's one of your airplanes, chum," said Curly, pausing at the rail with another bucket of slops. "And in trouble, by the look of her." "She's in trouble, right enough, Mr. Hughes." With the swiftness of a jet-propelled Argonaut, a great four-engined machine came hurtling through the sky, steadily losing height, smoke pouring from both the starboard engines and the port outer engine brilliantly on fire. With a great wish of air and a back-draft that made the big ketch stagger in her stride, the aircraft roared past at a little over mast-top height. They caught a glimpse of a tense face through the cockpit glass as the aircraft's captain fought at the controls. "He's ditching." The big aircraft had turned into the wind and was flying just above the sea, tail low. Now the tail struck the water, which splashed up in a mighty cascade, like the tremendous spout of some outsized whale, or the base of a waterspout. Again the tail struck, again. The spray and spume covered the aircraft. "He knows what he's doing, good man, taking the way off with the tail," shouted Yank. "Stand by, everyone," Mr. Hughes ordered. There was an instant tense response. "You go to the wheel, Iceland." Hans jumped to it. "Steer for the crash. Lads, now stand by the spinnaker and get the gaff topsail off her. Tiny, you and Edwards clear the boat. Get it off the chocks and swung outboard. Steady as she goes now, Iceland." The orders came with a bark, and the lads leapt. The spinnaker came in as if the big ketch was a racing dinghy, rounding a mark, and the gaff topsail fluttered down in the twinkling of an eye. Boys leapt to give a hand at clearing the boat. Meanwhile the airplane had rocketed to a stop, and it lay spread out upon the sea like a helpless piece of outsized tin, a big deflated can with its tail knocked off, and its enormous wings awash, as if it was putting out great arms to try to support itself. Already the water was lapping at the fuselage. "She won't last 5 minutes," said Mr. Hughes. "We'll run down. Stand by, lads, to lower the mainsail when I give the word." The airplane was now less than a cable away. The boys could see the American markings. It was a military machine, long and slim. They could see some men on one of the wings. A door was opened in the fuselage, and more men there were struggling with something that looked like a big sack. That would be their dinghy. The plane was settling steadily in the water. A figure in a yellow life jacket jumped from the broken tail. They saw him strike out in the water, making for the wing. "Stand by the halyards. Lower away. Boom midships, Yank." Down came the mainsail, or rather the mizzen, which was masquerading in its place on the run, with a singing of blocks and a rattle of good cordage. They were near enough to shout now. "Bring her up, Iceland. Steer for the port wing tip." Hans, imperturbable as ever, did as he was told upon the instant. The boat was ready at the falls. "Hold the boat, lads," Mr. Hughes shouted. "I'm going to try to get those fellows off right along their wing. Ahoy there, airplane," he bellowed, all inconvenience from his broken head completely forgotten. "Ahoy there, get out on the port wing. Jump, fort as I come by." Here, you shout to them, Yank. Maybe they don't get my accent. Hi, boys, on the left wing tip, shouted Yank. We'll sideswipe you, and you jump. Several figures waved. The Warspite, even under her shortened sail, was rushing at the wreck of the airplane now, in the last of the daylight. The sun had gone down long before, and there was a soft and lovely twilight. The scene was one of infinite peace and promise of goodwill. It seemed strange that men's lives should be at stake at such a time, but they would not be at stake long. Hans crouched over the wheel, Mr. Hughes beside him, saying nothing, watching the ship, gauging the distance, watching that big, useless, sinking thing, and the jagged wing which could rip a fatal hole in the Warspite if she misjudged, if she came too close. "Watch her, son, you're doing fine," said Mr. Hughes. "Lads, keep clear from the starboard shoulder of her now." The jib boom was in line with the jagged hole where the aircraft's tail had been. The sea was rushing into the broken fuselage. There, now the jib boom end was by the wing tip. Down staysail, down the staysail rushed, down mizzen. Down came the little leg of mutton on the mizzen as if it had been set on an elastic string. The big ketch halted in her stride, though still with manageable way. The aircraft rolled a lee, raising its port wing out of the sea. At that precise instant, 6 figures leapt from the wing tip onto the Warspite's deck. 2 of them landed perfectly. The other 4 landed on the first 2. A 7th fell in the sea. Mike flung him a life ring on a long line. He grabbed the buoy, and they began to haul him in. Even as he was being hauled to the side of the ship, the mottled bulk of the huge aircraft slipped into the deep water. With a greasy gurgle like water running out of an enormous bath. "Woo, nice work, boys," said a tall young man in the uniform of an American Army Air Force major, walking along the deck towards Mr. Hughes with outstretched hand. Osendovsky, the name. Hiram L. Osendovsky. This is my co-pilot, Mr. Glass. Mr. Glass is from Dallas, and this is the navigator, a bum he turned out to be, Mr. Eisenblum. This here's Mr. Hughes, and Mr. Yamamoto, and Mr. Halakala. Mr. Halakala's from Hawaii, so's Mr. Yamamoto. We were on a training flight. Engine trouble, he added laconically. Why, it's Owen Hughes from Krycheth, shouted the American. The major had introduced as Mr. Hughes. Owen Hughes. Why, Owen, Mr. Hughes shouted something in Welsh. Blimey, said Tiny. He's found a long-lost brother. It sure is a small world, said Yank. The 2 Mr. Hugheses were jabbering away in Welsh together by the wheel as fast as they could go, all thoughts of recent rescues and imperiled lives and everything else forgotten for the moment, but only for the moment. Put the sail back on her, my lads, Mr. Hughes remembered. Give her back the lot, and resume the course for Aberdovey. Aye, aye, sir, sang the lads, and the rescued airmen gave a hand to set all sail. The Ketch's bow was turned once more towards the Dovey bar, and she raced onwards. Chapter 14. Aberdovey at last. Why, dang it, there was a two-way radio in the dinghy, said the Major, when he suggested putting a message through to his headquarters. What dinghy, Major? Asked Tiny. Why, the one we ditched when you picked us up, son. That was a dinghy Johnny here was pitching through the escape hatch. Self-inflating, you know. They're wonderful things. Two-way radio in them, and all home comforts. Even an outboard motor in some of 'em, and a kite to fly an aerial, so's you have a chance to send messages over a fair distance. Food, too, and yellow stuff to discolor the sea, first aid and everything. Well, it's all gone now. But the 9 o'clock news, coming on in a few moments, dispelled all worry at any rate about the ship not having been seen. The Hellenus report was given, and the whereabouts of the Warspite were once again known to the world. So they would be expected off the bar in the morning. The American airmen settled aboard as if they were as much seafarers as airfarers, an animated group consisting of young Don Wiggins, Nick Sanusian, Curly Matheson, and Michael Leary listened open-mouthed while Johnny Halakala regaled them with tales of old Hawaii, real and imaginary. None of the boys had ever seen a real Hawaiian before. Such figures belonged to romance. They stared at Johnny Halakala. He pronounced his name something like Haleakala, as if they rather expected him to turn into a chanting Polynesian at any moment, and hoped he would. But it turned out that Johnny, or so he said, had been a cowboy on a pineapple plantation on the island of Lanai before enlisting. A cowboy on a pineapple plantation, said Don Wiggins, prepared to believe anything about Hawaii but unable to understand what a cowboy would do at a roundup of golden pineapples. Yeah, said Johnny, delighted with his audience. That's me, all right. That there pineapple ranches so big, fellows, there's a cattle ranch to supply beef for the labor. I look after them steers. Why, that whole island is one big plantation. It's more'n 100 square miles, bigger'n Wales. Bigger'n Wales, my foot, shouted Chum Jones, who was near, unable to stomach that, though he never in his life had previously heard of Lanai. It's about as big as Bardsey. As big as Wales or not, and it certainly was not. It seemed that the plantation island of Lanai was a fascinating place, and the lads sat enthralled. It seemed that Lanai produced the most wonderful and the largest pineapples in the whole world, and the life of a cowboy there was one long horse-borne holiday. Even George Yamamoto was listening intently, It turned out that Mr. Yamamoto, in civil life, was a waiter at a Filipino nightclub by Waikiki Beach. According to him, so was Johnny. Mr. Hughes, Welsh friend from Christchurch, had immigrated to the USA after the war. He had been in the Royal Air Force in the 39 through 45 mix-up. So he had enlisted in the U.S. Air Force after the fearful cold of a winter in Detroit had proved worse weather than anything even Tremadoc Bay had to offer. The two Mr. Hughes were jabbering away half the night. The mate of the Warspite had been in the States too, many a time, as a sailing ship sailor. The fact that his real acquaintance with it extended, in the main, to the Case oil berths at Hoboken shortly after the turn of the century, the Seamen's Church Institute on South Street, and the Bowery, did not in the least deter him from offering all kind of advice and recounting all sorts of reminiscences to his friends. It was a real sailor's yarn. The Major, who was a quiet man, was somewhat astonished at first to learn there was an American boy in the Warspite, and that he was at Eton, a student at Eton. He kept repeating over and over again, "Why, boy, whatever made you want to go there?" "I didn't want," Yank hastened to explain. "It was my old man's idea." "But it isn't so bad, sir." As a matter of fact, he found himself remembering with rather a jolt that he actually did go on to Eton. And what's more, ought to be back there the following week. It was going to be a bit of a shock, suddenly finding himself ashore again, and a schoolboy. At length, Johnny Halakala ran out of yarns. The Major ran out of superlatives for the lines of the Warspite, and the nice turn of seamanship the lads had shown picking up his crew, and the two Mr. Hughes had talked themselves out for the moment. The ship gradually settled down. The airmen were given bunks in the boys' quarters, on the settees in the comfortable saloon, and the Major in the captain's cabin. The two Mr. Hughes stretched out in the deck-house, to be handy for looking at the first glimpse of whales in the morning, and soon all but the watch on deck were wrapped in slumber. "Hearken for the Dovey bells," they called to Yank, "and call us if you hear them." Yank had the watch. He walked the small quarter-deck, balancing with perfect rhythm as the ketch rolled, and ran along as if he had been there all his life. He no longer noticed that the ship had motion. Was it only a week or so since they had come aboard? It seemed incredible. He looked up at the stars, watched the slow roll of the mastheads, admired the perfect grace of the wind-filled sails, went again and again forward in the eyes of her to listen to her tramping down the sea. Taffy was on lookout there. Taffy was silent, drinking in the peace and wonder of it all too. The roll of foam before the bows was a pleasant sound, and the wake stretched away phosphorescent upon the black surface of the water. Far off astern was the loom of the Tusker light, and away on the port bow the loom of another brilliant light, which must be Bardsey, So far so good. The west wind held, and for once the skies overhead continued bright and clear. The wind had quietened somewhat, and the patent log showed that the ketch was running about 6 knots. It was a delight to feel the grip of the spokes of the wheel. Yank could not tear himself below when the time came for his relief. "Better get some sleep," said Tiny. "Do you know what day it is?" "Can't say I do, Tiny. I haven't been bothering much about the days. But let me see now. Why, it must be Friday. Why, and how long since we came to the school?" Yank reckoned a moment. "It'll be 4 weeks this Saturday tomorrow." "Well, my lad, it's tomorrow you'll be rushing around the mountains, you and all of us. Last Saturday in the course, you know. That's Mountain Expedition Day." "Why, doggone, so it is." Yank mused a moment. "You know, Tiny," he said at last, "I sure hadn't thought of that, and if anybody'd told me just 3 short weeks ago that I'd be looking forward to running 35 miles around a bunch of North Welsh mountains any time between now and Kingdom Come, I'd have said they were nuts or worse. And yet now, why I am. Roll along mountains, good old Cotter Idris," laughed Tiny. "But we will need some sleep, Yank, or we'll find when we get ashore that we've got such good sea legs that our mountain climbing legs are no good at all." Yank grinned, but still he could not tear himself from the deck. "Tiny," he said, "I'll tell you another thing that'll make you think I'm going nuts. I'm envious of you, you know, going to sea for life. Why not come too?" "Can't. The old man has me booked for the U.S. Air Force." "Well, it wouldn't be like this. I know that," Tiny went on, almost speaking to himself, "but it will have its moments. I'm looking forward to it. I always have. It's a man's life, serving ships. And an important life, too. Somehow, I just like ships, all ships. Why, if there's nothing else about, I can admire barges. I'm envious, I am. You'll have your airplanes, though. They're noisy, tiny, and too darned fast. By the time I'm a pilot, they'll all be jet-propelled, and probably have retractable wings, and turn into rockets. Soon's they're airborne, doing a couple of 1,000 miles an hour. They'll get everywhere so darned fast there'll be no point in going or hurrying back, because soon's you're there, you can be back again. I like the quietness of it here, and I don't know, the sort of feeling that it's us that's at least helping the old ship do her stuff. We matter here. You know, I never felt so sort of settled in mind in all my life before as I've felt on this passage here. Yeah, even with its worries, perhaps because of 'em. After all, we did lick 'em." Tiny pondered over Yank's remarks. "I've felt the same way too," he said at last, bending to the binnacle to get a rough bearing on Bardsey and the Tusker loom. "I expect that's why they send us here. Rocket driver punk. Ah, well, maybe they'll cost $1 million apiece, and nobody'll trust me with one." Yank went on with some gloom. The soft light from the binnacle showed his young face puckered with worries. It looked so funny, so unlike Yank, that Tiny laughed. "There'll always be ships to come back to, Yank," he said. "You know that chap who said I have had a lot of worries, most of which have never happened. Had something. You'd better start thinking some more about running around Cotter Idris before you spoil your night's sleep, what's left of it, plaguing yourself about driving rocket ships through the sky. I have had a lot of worries, most of which have never happened. You know I like that. Good night, Tiny. Guess I'll go below that lanai cowboy's in my bunk, though. Use mine. Good night, Yank." Yank tore himself away and lopped off forward. Moments later, his tousled head was still to be seen, silhouetted against the soft light of the night, looking out from the forward companion as he continued to muse upon the scene. The mate was called at his own orders at the crack of dawn, at the very first showing of gray in the eastern sky. There were no lights to make for at Aberdovey Bar, and he wanted to check the landfall. All the lads were up before 6, scrubbing the deck down, polishing brass, and generally getting everything spick and span, and Bristol fashion for coming into port. The mackerel were abundant, and a grand breakfast was assured. A pale sun climbed slowly over the mountains, and shone upon the bay, and as it dispersed, the early morning mist, the mountains themselves, rose into view. Steadily the ship sailed towards them. Once again, all the wondrous backdrop of the grand Welsh scene showed in its loveliness. It seemed incredible that any gale had ever roared here, bringing these gentle waters to a violent tumult, making the whole coast a dangerous lee shore. Now far off, even the peak of Snowdon smiled, and all the foothills vied to set the great mountain off, and the skyline was an artist's dream. There were Cotter Idris, Bird Rock in its wild valley, the tall mark upon the hill that showed the Sarny Bwitch patches, the big golfing hotel that was a good landmark by the entrance of the Dovey. The Dovey bluff showed fine and clear. Coming in from the southwest, the pleasant little port showed open to the sea beyond the shelter of its bar. Now they could see the outer buoy, the refuge on the tidal flats, and the mast of the Garibaldi. Flags were flying from the staff at the wharf. Boats were coming out. Here was Ellis Williams, with his strong, big ferry. The Ketch had her best blue ensign at the peak, and her Sunday house flag at the main. Her brass work gleamed, and her teak decks were spotless. Even the brass letters of her name upon both bows were polished until they reflected the smiling sea. The ferry was approaching rapidly, and with it the big new launch from Swan Hunter's Neptune yard, and back of them all the fishing craft, the pleasure craft, and assorted vessels from the town, dinghies and small craft that had never before ventured across the bar, were dancing on the morning sea. All the dinghies, all the cutters, all the whalers, and the lifeboats belonging to the school were either under way on the broad estuary or outside already. Another and another string of flags went up on the wharf. The Garibaldi was covered with them. The tall houses along the waterfront street were putting out flags. The sun shone upon all Aberdovi, and the seaside town was looking its very best. The fairway buoys came into view. The marks for making the bar passage were plainly to be seen. Yank went to the wheel, Taffy to the bows. Mr. Hughes stood by the wheel to con. Hans the Icelander had one lead line, Tiny another, standing in either bow. Now there was plenty of water on the bar. The breakers ran upon the bar with only a quiet sound, murmuring, as if they were promising ever after to be good. The sands of Borth were golden in the morning sun, and the Dovey Valley looked like the Bay of Naples. The boat was alongside. Ferryman Williams, his weather-beaten face covered with a great grin, shouted a welcome. The warden of the school, Mr. McDermott, the first lieutenant, smiling old Zim, and a host of distinguished gentlemen none of the boys had ever seen before, leaped over the rail. These were the governors of the school and members of the trust, who had hurried to Aberdovi in slow trains through the night when they heard the good news that the warspite was coming in. "Well done, boys! Well done, Mr. Hughes!" A tall elderly gentleman greeted them. "Are you all well, and all here? Ah, I see you've picked up some recruits on the way." "American airmen, sir, from a crashed plane. We're all here, all right, but please do not congratulate me. I've had nothing to do with it all. It was the boys. They've sailed her right around all Ireland." "Why, bless my soul, you don't say. But what happened when you'd crossed the causeway and showed the ship off the bar here?" "I was knocked out, sir. Knocked clean out. It was the boys who looked after her, and they looked after me." "Don't believe the mate too literally, sir," said Yank. "It was he brought us across the causeway, he and Taffy here. That was the only time she was ever in a real jam. Without Mr. Hughes, none of us would be here indeed. Us boys just took the line of least resistance, and ran off before the wind. It stayed south until we were out of the Irish Sea, so we had to come around Ireland." "Well, well, well, this is the kind of passage I've dreamed about. But we mustn't arrange it too often now, must we, Mr. Hughes, or Captain?" said the gentleman, turning to the warspite's captain, who was looking very pleased to be back aboard. Meanwhile the ketch was running through the approach channel towards the bar, Mr. Hughes watching the marks, the lads in the bows flailing with the hand leads, and calling the depths, which were never less than 3.5 fathoms, for it was nearly high tide. The ketch raced along when the tide got hold of her, as if she were a horse which had smelled her home stables. Now she was through the channel across the bar, and all the estuary was as quiet and flat as a riverside meadow, except for the tide running swift and dark. Down came the sails, halfway along the short stretch between the bar and the wharf. Ferryman Williams came alongside to swing the ship head to tide, and put her alongside as gently as a new laid egg, bows outward to the sea. The wharf was black with people, many of whom had been brought by an enterprising coach proprietor from Machynlleth and from Towin, and as far away as Dolgelly, up the valley behind Barmouth. "Hurrah for the main toppers!" shouted the lads in the cutters and the whalers. 3 cheers for good old Main Top. The youthful cheers resounded in the valley. "Why," said the Major, "was it you boys that brought the ship all round Ireland without an officer at all?" "It was that," said Mr. Hughes, "for I was unconscious." The whole way until she'd sailed past Fastnet. Maybe it was just as well, for likely I'd not have thought to do it, and it worked out so fine. Why, I call that worth a cheer," said the Major, and lined up his crew to cheer the lads from the wharf too, before they hurried away. "Now, main toppers, you've done extremely well, and we are delighted to see you," said the warden. "This morning clear up the ship, and there'll be a truck down from the school to take up your gear. This afternoon you're to rest. Cotter adrift tomorrow, you know. So rest up this afternoon. Briefing is this evening. Donaldson and Brown," he continued, addressing Tiny and Yank. "Any spare time you have, you'd better brush up your map reading. And it would be no harm done if the rest of you did likewise. But any boy, of course, who feels that he doesn't care to face the mountain trip tomorrow may be excused. The doctor will check you all this afternoon. It looks like a fine day tomorrow. Anyone not feel like going?" Complete silence fell on the eager boys for the first time since they had sighted the outer buoy. "I'll have a go at it, sir," said Brum Shrivenham. "Me too," and "me." It was a regular chorus. "What is?" asked the Icelander, slightly bewildered by the tumult of the welcome and now the announcement of the mountain expedition. "Climbin' mountains," whispered Chum Jones. "Okay," said Hans, obviously more bewildered than ever. What was all this about mountains? An extraordinary lot, those English fellows, and when they found themselves mixed up with the Welsh in Wales, why, he gave it up and slipped down below to boil some tea, for the coffee beans were exhausted. "I reckon it's a good job we are going up the mountains tomorrow, Tiny," said Yank, "up at the school late that afternoon. This welcome's fair worn me out, and walking around these level streets is getting me down." "You old moaner!" Tiny laughed, and Yank grinned a broad, infectious grin. Chapter 15. A Silver Badge. Anybody who spends a night on this mountain is bound to turn into a poet or go nuts, Yank was saying to Tiny on the summit of Cotter Idris. "I'm not hoping to spend the night here, but I feel both a poet and nuts now. But just look at that view, and drink in this air." "All mountains do things to you," said Tiny, "but this, why, it really is something." Below, in all directions, stretched the lovely panorama of North Wales. The day was perfect, and had been so since early morning, when the boys first set off. To the west lay Cardigan Bay, like a big blue plain. To the north, south, east, and every direction in between, lay the picturesque valleys, with the peaks and spurs and hills rising from them, each fitting perfectly into the whole, as if the panorama had been designed to be as beautiful and as breathtaking as it possibly could be. Little hill farms nestled here and there, the big towns of Barmouth and Dolgelly, which Taffy called Dolgethily, or something like that, spread like pictured scenes against the hills and the sea. Behind Barmouth, the tidal Modoc showed no ripple to disturb its perfect surface. Below the southern slope lay the hamlet of Tollylin, with its mountain lake, and to the west a little Abergynolwyn. Down the Decenny valley was Bird Rock, looking curious from inshore, and above it, when it had only been seen from the sea, the whole glorious scene rolling away to Giant Snowdon in the north, and Nevin Peninsula looking as if it had spread itself out to be admired, and was basking in the mid-morning sun, happy and pleasant. St. Tudwall's Roads, the harbour of Pwllheli, Bluff, Waliffa, and Trin-Ceylon, Bardsey in the distance, all showed up well. "Did we ever struggle in a ship down there?" asked Chum Jones, puffing up. "It hardly seems believable." Taffy was singing a song in Welsh. Brum Shrivenham was seated on a piece of rock, munching a fisherman's slice of bread and cheese, and staring amazed at the view, not saying anything. Mike, young Don Wiggins, Pete Cordoba, and Nicky Sanusian were talking excitedly about the wild landscape all round them, and misrecognizing everything. The Icelander was boiling a pot of tea in the lee of a lichen-covered clump of granite, while he too munched at a great chunk of bread and mackerel with his free hand. Perhaps he was thinking of the briefing in old Zim's cabin up at the school the previous evening. "Don't you go and run off with our mountains as you did with the war spite," old Zim had said, grinning, "leaving our good Mr. Hughes to bring her back." He went on, dishing out flash lamps, pocket compasses, rucksacks, first aid kits, whistles, ordnance maps, instruction sheets, and advice, which was all to the point. "Wear your strongest shoes, 2 pairs of woolen socks, and warm clothing, lads," he'd said. "Only eat when halted, and then slowly, and don't drink out of the mountain streams, unless you've made sure the water is running, clear and without any smell, and then don't drink much, and no calling at the tea farms either." Hans knew those tea farms. They were famous places, dotted here and there on the hills, where a boy could drop in for a really enormous meal called tea. Tea was the least part of such repasts. Hans smacked his lips and decided that he wouldn't pass any tea farms if he could help it. "Another thing," old Zim had said, "keep a check of your position whenever you can. You never know when a cloud might roll in, and you'll have to grope your way back. Keep a moderate pace. It isn't a race, you know. And keep together. That's the important thing. You're all divided into groups of 6, each group with either the watch captain or the vice captain. Keep together, don't hurry, and don't dawdle. If there are footpaths, use them, and don't follow streams because water follows the steepest path, and you'll do better to keep to the shoulders of the hill that encloses the stream. When you're going up a mountain, use grass slopes if you can find them, and place your feet carefully so as not to dislodge stones and rocks. Somebody might be below. There'll be more than 90 boys scampering round Ch10-15 in 16 parties. Remember your teammates. Then Zim went over the routes in full detail and made sure the boys thoroughly understood their maps and had mastered the pocket compass. It was all very thorough, very interesting, and very pleasant. "One last thing," said Zim. "When you get back, report in. If you don't get back, phone. But everybody always has got back so far, and you're the 8,000th. And remember this, you have to write an individual account of your expedition." That was where Hans had become really worried. In English, he'd asked. "Well, preferably, but any language will do." "Oh ho," said Hans, very dubiously. He was still looking worried when he turned in, though he'd never been worried in the catch. Then, at the crack of dawn, off they'd all gone, the 96 of them in their 16 groups. Some one way, some another. Most did the first few miles by train. Some struck inland from Towen and up past Dolgotch and Abergynolwyn to Callien and up the southern slope. A few went to Moshnaloth Toff, called the Mokoth Hunlith, but most of the others left the name up unpronounced, and across country to the nor'ward from there, towards the mountain called Ch10-15. Others were to climb from Arthog. The routes were worked out to ensure that each party traveled something like the same distance in the day, between 35 and 40 good miles. Officers from the school went by bicycle and jeep to strategic points to check the parties and make sure all was going well. It was a well-organized day, and everything went with a swing. Young Don tripped over a sheep on his first hillside, and the others roared at him, but that was the only accident, if you could call it an accident. Every one of those lads reached the summit of Ch10-15 as fresh as a young horse. "I would never have believed it," said Tiny as they sat together over their sandwiches, and Hans 100-octane tea. "Nobody ever does," said Zim, who was up there too. "I've watched their faces every time they first hear about this run, and they fall like an avalanche down the Matterhorn. But by the time the day comes, it's all a great lark. Sometimes there are storms, of course, and it's impossible to do a long expedition. Then they're all disappointed." "You certainly feel good when you do it," said Tiny. "You know what I say, chaps," began Chum Jones. "It's a blooming jolly wizard good show." They all shouted before he could say another word. "Yes, I'll stand by that," Chum Jones shouted defiantly. "Well, lads, watch yourselves on the way down," was Zim's counsel. "Most accidents happen then. It's easier to turn your ankle going down than coming up. And ankles are rationed, remember. 2 apiece for life. Look after them." It was the very last of the lovely Welsh twilight when Tiny and Yank at last led their groups back to the school after an experience that none of the boys was ever likely to forget. Then they fell at once upon a range of mountains of fish and fried potatoes stacked high on the mess tables, and demolished the lot in the twinkling of an eye. Late at night, poor Hans was still puzzling over his essay on the expedition. He kept chewing a pencil until there was nothing left of it to chew. Then he'd borrow another and do the same with that. After an hour and a half, all he had in front of him was the same sheet of blank paper he'd begun on, and written on it was a heading only. Expedition, it said. "Hi, Iceland, turn in," Tiny shouted at last. Hans grabbed the pencil with desperation, holding it as if it were an ice pick. He stabbed it at the paper. "Expedition," he wrote. "Bloomin' good show." Then he turned in. The course was over with the expedition. There remained only the test, the 5-mile walk and a mile run, and long and high jumping, and so forth. So long as a fellow did his best, he was all right. The tests weren't meant to produce a few champions for the others to sit and look at and brag about. The tests were contrived, like everything else had been, to bring out the unsuspected best in each fellow, and the standards were adjusted to age and individual ability. The boys were set to beat their own previous best, and never mind about anybody else's. "Cripes," said Nicky Sanusian, as he cleared 4 feet 8 inches. "I never jumped a blooming thing in my life before I came here, 'cept a key," and he hurled the javelin 85 feet. "I never had a chance to throw a javelin either," he explained, "so I'm going to chuck this one a good long way." He did. The upshot of it all was that the main toppers came out at the head of all the washes. On the last morning, when the young sea captain, who was warden of the school, gave out the badges to those who had richly earned them, every boy in main-top watch found himself awarded the coveted silver badge. Nothing like it had ever happened in the history of the school. There was a special board in the entrance hall on which the names of all previous winners of the silver badge were inscribed, and it was a small board. The silver badge was not easily awarded, but now a new board had to be made, especially to take the names of the lads of main-top watch. "Well done," said the warden. Yank looked down at the silver badge shining in the lapel of his coat with a great pride, and so did they all. The silver badges were still shining on the lapels of 12 assorted coats when the boys dispersed to go once more to the humdrum, ordinary world from which they had come a few short weeks before. Most of them left from Aberdovey Station, the same station where they had arrived. Conway lads were travelling northwards through the Barmouth and up to Afan Wen, so close to Abersoch and ancient Caernarvon. Taffy went that way too, though he was taking bus at Pwllheli for Nevin to spend a day or two at home before joining his ship again at Birkenhead. The others joined the express at Dovey Junction, which went up the valley to Shrewsbury, past Machynlleth and Llanbrynmawr and Seswas. At Shrewsbury, they split up again, some for Liverpool and Manchester, and points north, others for Birmingham and Coventry, and Hereford and Oxford and London. Yank found himself wondering whether he would ever see them again. The lads looked so odd, dressed again in their own clothes, but there was the stamp of the outward bound about them all, Don and Taffy in their rough clothes and cloth caps, Chum Jones in the smart rig of a sea-going cadet, Hans with his blue jersey changed for a grey with an enormous roll-top collar and his flaxen hair imprisoned in a blue skull cap. Brom Shrivenham sported an Hawaiian shirt in a gaudy floral pattern which he must have got from Johnny Halakala. It was so bright it fairly warmed up the compartment and brought light even upon Shrewsbury railway station. Nicky Sanusian's eyes were shining, and the pasty colour had gone from his cheeks, and his spivs drape coat hung oddly on his broadening shoulders. Nicky was no spiv, and never had been, but he might have developed into one. The chances that he'd do so now were much reduced. Yank sat back as the express thundered along from Birmingham towards Paddington, and closed his eyes. Rough clothes, brass-buttoned reefers, fishermen's jerseys, long hair, tousled hair, broom heads of crimson, dark skin, fair skin, red skin, from Iceland, Ecuador, Ireland, Wales, England, USA. What a lot of artificial barriers there were, and how they had all melted away in the clean sea air, and among the rugged mountain passes. The silly barriers and all the flim-flam of life. Yank had heard a lot about the modern boy, much of which had been addressed to him. He'd thought it nonsense at the time. Now he knew it was. These lads were all right, and they always would be all right, if they got the chance to feel they were alive. That's what the Warspite and the hills had done for them. They'd felt they were alive, really living, not just getting up in the morning and putting clothes on to shuffle through the day. What was that slogan he'd read on the bulkhead in the Ketch's saloon? Ah, he remembered it. To serve, to strive, and not to yield. That was the thing. To serve the team, whatever team that might be, to do one's best, and never give in. It was not a bad idea, at that.